Hey everyone, I hope you're doing great. This week we are going to be taking a look at how do you choose your first 3D printer. In our last video, we discussed why I think 2024 is the perfect time for you to finally buy a 3D printer. Moving forward from that, I want to talk about how exactly do you go about choosing your first machine. This is going to be the kind of episode 0 for a new series of videos that we're going to be working on over the next few months about 3D printing for beginners. We're trying to put together a guide that's as comprehensive as we know how to make it to help beginners and people with little to no experience in 3D printing dive in as much as possible. Recently, we got 2 new machines in the studio, and on the outside, they're really similar. But on the inside and from a user experience perspective, they're very different. One machine is designed to be as incredibly straightforward and user-friendly as possible, and the other is taking a more complicated route to achieve the same kind of goal. And we're going to dive into those machines deeper in future videos. But it got us thinking. How exactly should somebody go through the thought process when it comes to buying a 3D printer? How do you decide which 3D printer is the best 3D printer for me? We're going to be looking at a few different points to help you arrive at that conclusion. We may mention a few specific machines, but we're not going to make very many concrete recommendations. We'll just allude to some machines that might fall into these certain categories. When it comes to choosing a 3D printer, there's a few things that you want to keep in mind while you're going through this process. The first thing that I recommend is thinking about, what do I want a 3D printer for? What am I going to be making? If you're going to be making functional and structural parts, then you're probably going to want something more like a filament-based machine. If you're going to be printing like D&D minis or something like that, resin might be a little bit more for you. There are pros and cons to both. Those just go into the opening stages of what is my thought process of which machine am I going into. The next few things that you're going to want to keep in mind are going to be the price. What is a price that I'm comfortable paying? The size of the machine. How much printer do you really need for what you want to make? What kind of materials can I print on the machine? How user-friendly is the experience? Diving into the filament versus resin 3D printer topic first. Filament-based 3D printing is going to be the absolute most common, and it's probably what most people think about when they think about the phrase 3D printing. And it's probably going to be what most people watching this video are going to choose, so that's what we're going to focus on the most. And that's because it seems to be about the most straightforward, at least it is in my opinion, and there's a lot more options in terms of machines and price points when it comes to filament-based machines. And what I mean by that is a filament-based 3D printer is one that's going to take a string of filament from a spool like this and then feed it through a printer that is effectively working a lot like a robot CNC controlled hot glue gun. The machine takes that filament and builds it up layer by layer until eventually you have a model, something that looks like this really cool little mason jar candy dispenser. And these parts are going to be inherently stronger than resin machines, and while they may not look as nice, the surface finish might not be as good, they're still going to be so cool. And it's always an exciting thing when you have a successful part come off of the print bed. Now, on the other hand, a resin 3D printer, really simply put, is going to produce incredibly high resolution models. The general, really overly simplified way that this works is the print bed slowly raises from a vat of UV curable resin that is masked off by what amounts to be a cell phone screen. Every time the layer height increases, every time your print bed moves up, your resin gets blasted with high power UV light, and your model is slowly built up over time. However, resin 3D printing does have a lot more downsides, in my opinion, than filament-based printing. While you do get these really high detailed and great looking models, they're going to be weaker. They require more specialized equipment. So while resin does have some amazing results, it's a lot of mess, it can be toxic, and you need to be extra careful with it. Whereas a filament-based printer, your biggest concern is whether it sticks to the print bed and that your machine's not a fire hazard. So now that we have the basic general idea of filament versus resin, we're going to assume that most folks watching this video are going to take the filament-based printer path. And that leads us to our next question. What exactly is the budget that you've set aside to be able to fund your very first 3D printer? And that's what's awesome about the filament-based machine category, because you're looking at an overall budget range starting at about $99 if you have a micro center nearby, upwards of thousands of dollars. And there are so many awesome different machines that you can get in that range. Like if you have a Micro Center near you, they'll have insert Ender 3 variant here on sale regularly for less than $200. And that's going to be an amazing machine to get you started. Your print quality may not be the greatest without a lot of tuning. Your print speed might not be the fastest without even more tuning, but it's enough to get you started. So if you're a student, or maybe you're just not even sure if 3D printing is really gonna be for you, that's gonna be kind of the price point you're gonna be starting at, is around $200 to get a decent machine. Now there are sales that happen pretty regularly beyond that, and going up from there is just going to unlock a whole host of new features. You're going to get increased speed, you're going to get increased reliability, Wi-Fi connectivity, so you don't have to actually physically walk over to the printer and use storage medium like a flash drive or a micro SD card. An additional thing to keep in mind when you're looking at the budget for your machine is you're going to need material. Regardless of whether you chose a filament-based 3D printer or a resin-based 3D printer, you need material. You're going to either need to buy a spool of filament or a bottle of resin to get you started. A lot of printers will come with a sample of filament, but those samples are usually junk and just throw them away because it's not worth your aggravation trying to print from a little tiny coil. End rant here. And once you start narrowing down how much you're comfortable with spending for a 3D printer and you've kind of decided on your focus, then you can start looking at the features of a 3D printer. For example, if you start at that $200 Ender 3 variant and you work your way up, you start to get a whole slew of features that are opened up to you. Things like increased print speed due to the machine being better made and more sturdy with higher quality materials, which higher quality materials typically is going to lead to an increase in overall reliability of your printer, which means you're going to have less downtime and less failed parts. You're also going to see, maybe as you go up, larger print volumes. Something like an SV06 from Soval is a great machine to start. It's very similar to a Prusa style 3D printer, but for $100 to $200 more, depending on how the sales stack out, you can actually pick up an SV06 Plus and get something that's going to be 300 millimeters by 300 millimeters on the print bed that you can actually print a full-size wearable helmet. And if you're into cosplay and that's why you're buying a 3D printer, it's a pretty fantastic option. That's something that you're going to want to keep in mind. If you're not into tinkering and you don't want to mess around with the printer, you just want to press print, you're probably going to want to spring for a machine that has automatic bed leveling or automatic tramming. That's going to help keep your process as hands-free as possible and just let you make cool stuff. Additional features to be on the lookout for are whether the machine is enclosed. That's going to open up material choices, so that way you can print high-temp materials like ABS right out of the gate without additional add-ons. And whether your machine has a filament runout sensor, because if you're doing a long print, there's absolutely nothing worse than hitting the end of the spool and the printer just keeps going and printing into air, and you lose a day and a half of work and feels like there's no way to recover. Before we move on to the next bit of the video, I'd like to take a moment to thank our level 4 and level 3 YouTube members, Deanna Duffy and Nathan Wolford, respectively. If you want to support what we're doing here at Rem Thompson's Maker Shed, be sure to consider giving us a subscribe, like the video and share with a friend, and if you really want to go the extra mile, we do have channel memberships available and we're working on adding more awesome perks to that. So when you're putting together your initial budget, how much you're planning to spend for your first 3D printer, make sure you're keeping the add-ons in mind. A suggestion that I have to you is maybe buy more printer than you think that you'll use in terms of features. What I mean by that is if you know there's a specific machine that you want and maybe you're going to settle for a machine that's less expensive just because that's where your budget is right now, maybe consider saving just a little bit longer to get a little bit more machine. Because what tends to happen with people who really love 3D printing is you buy an inexpensive machine because that's what you can afford, and then you throw hundreds of dollars and hundreds of hours at upgrading, tuning, and calibrating, and now you've spent more than the price of the machine that you wanted initially. That is what I did, and I don't really recommend that path anymore unless you're a tinkerer. If you like to tinker and you want working on the machine to be part of the hobby and experience for you, then by all means buy the less expensive machine and upgrade it to be whatever you want it to be. That's the beauty thing about 3D printing is there are so many parts companies making aftermarket upgrades for these machines and wonderful members of the community who are designing parts that will help facilitate your growth and level up your machine. But if you're a hands-off kind of person, maybe don't buy an Ender 3 and hope that it'll print like a bamboo. Save the extra couple $100 and just buy the bamboo from the start, because I promise your 3D printing experience will be much better if you're happier with the machine. Far too many people, unfortunately, buy an inexpensive machine without as much idea of how to use it, and then when they don't get good prints or have a lot of print failures, they're unhappy with the entirety of the hobby of 3D printing, and the machine sits and collects dust and just doesn't get the love that it deserves. So don't pigeonhole yourself because you have $200 today, but in a couple of weeks, you could have $500 to buy the little bit nicer machine. I recommend really planning out your purchase and make sure that you have money for a lot of filament, because once you start printing, you're gonna go through a lot of it. I never print more than when I get a new machine. And that's not just because we're producing content and doing test prints. It's because personally, for me, part of the addiction of 3D printing is the technology. And the technology of getting a new machine excites me like you wouldn't believe. And you will go through a ton of filament. And if you're into getting a good deal on filament, I highly suggest checking out my link in the description below for New Makers Filament. We do have an affiliate link that does help support the channel. And if you use promo code RTMS at checkout, you'll save 5%. In addition to their tiered pricing, you get the 5% discount. And I really like the material. I've been using it a ton since November, and it's a great value. When you're working on choosing which 3D printer you want to go with, you have to think about your applications. What are you going to be printing? If you're going to be printing things that are going to be decorative and functional in the house, like planters and pots, then chances are most of your prints are going to be in PLA. PLA is a filament that is the most popular in 3D printing because you get a great blend of ease of printing, reliability, low warping, low fail rates as long as your machine is dialed, and there are a ton of modifiers that can be added. You can get PLAs that have a matte surface finish. You can get PLAs that are glittery. There are silk PLAs, which are going to have a metallic sheen to them. And all of those materials are going to have slightly different properties. Like regular PLA is going to have more tensile strength and more ruggedness than a silk PLA, which is going to be more brittle. And when it breaks, the pieces might be a little bit sharper. That's due to the modifier that makes it shiny. If you're going to be printing parts that you're going to put in your car, a lot of car enthusiasts are starting to pick up on 3D printing because you can replicate parts that you may not have been able to make before. You're going to want a machine that can do ABS or ASA, and that means you're going to need a fully enclosed printer for a couple of reasons. One, those materials are going to off-gas some pretty nasty stuff. If you don't believe me, I'm gonna link a video in the description for Loyal Moses' channel. He talks about how he got ASA sickness, how printing ASA in an enclosed room made him very sick. These enclosures will help to contain those really nasty things inside, and a lot of the fully enclosed printers are also going to have filters that help pull the nasty chemicals out of the air. The other thing with ASA and ABS especially is they are really prone to warping up off of the build plate. So they need a constant, stable temperature in the area around the printer, and that's where the enclosure comes into play. It helps to hold some heat in, which is going to make the material slowly cool down, and it's also going to remove the possibility of getting a draft onto your part. Those drafts are going to be a sudden increase in cool air around the hot plastic piece on the print bed that's going to make it warp, and that's probably going to make it either unsightly or unusable. The next thing that you're going to want to look at is going to be the overall user friendliness of the machine that you're looking at. Some machines are going to require you to only use like a little micro SD card to transfer print files from your computer onto the 3D printer. Some machines are going to have networking equipped, which means you can send a print via your web browser. Some machines will let you go straight from the slicer, which is the program you use to actually set the parameters for your print and go from a 3D model to a 3D printable piece directly to your machine. And then some of the newer generation machines even have mobile apps. So you can actually find 3D prints that already have all the parameters set, scroll through the app, and just press print and send it straight to your machine. And a few hours later, you'll have a part on your print bed. A word of caution with these are going to be parameters and tunings that were set by other users. So make sure that you're reading through very carefully and make sure that the parameters the other user has set up are going to be compatible with your material and your machine. And then you're going to have to look at how do you interface with the machine.
Am I doing it right? What? Interfacing with my machine. Yes. Perfect.
I have said time and time and time again that I don't think that a 3D printer needs a touchscreen, and I think it's kind of a redundant point. However, for a lot of operations, having a touchscreen for most users is going to be an easier process. Chances are you have a smartphone if you're watching this video, and having a 3D printer with a touchscreen is going to be much more similar to interacting with your phone or tablet than it is with a 1990s copy machine. So look at that as well. Make sure that when you're going through your decision process, you're watching 3D printer reviews. I don't ever use a review as a guideline exclusively as to whether I'm going to buy a machine or not. I'm looking for community feedback, YouTube reviews, and then does this machine check the boxes for everything that I'm trying to do? And those are kind of the independent decisions that I put together in my head. I would never personally buy a machine just because one person says, don't buy this machine. I don't care about that. What is good about it? What is bad about it? And how you interface with the machine, be it a mobile app, web browser, or touchscreen or scroll wheel, those are all things that you are going to have to decide. What is the most important to you when it comes to interacting with the machine? The next consideration that you'll probably have in mind when you're shopping for your first 3D printer is going to be the overall noise amount. How loud is this 3D printer? And that's going to be a very subjective thing based off of where is the printer going to live. If it's going to be out in your garage, chances are you're not going to care at all about how loud it is, especially if you don't hang out near the machine while it's running. However, if you're like myself and you have 3D printers scattered all throughout your home, chances are you're going to be a little bit more on the sound conscious side. You're going to be looking for a machine that you could potentially sleep through or hear your TV over. And some of us are gifted heavy sleepers, and personally, I can go to sleep with the sound of my 3D printers just whirring away just fine. Some folks are not quite as fortunate, and a stiff breeze will wake them up. Some machines, like my Bamboo A1 Mini, is essentially completely silent even when it's in operation. When it's sitting there doing nothing, you can hardly tell. On the inverse, we have the Anker Make M5, and the M5 is a certified noisy boy. When it's not in operation, it is still making a lot of sound because of the cooling fans being used to cool the electronics. So if you're sound sensitive, you should probably listen to the sound that some of these machines are making during the reviews that you're watching to find out how loud exactly is it. Older 3D printers sounded like 80s techno music. Newer machines are just going to make some mechanical noises. And printers are continuing to get quieter, but depending on your workspace and where your printer is going to live, that's a consideration that you should probably have in the back of your mind. This brings us to the last point that I have, and this might be the most important, and for some folks it might not be important at all. That's going to be support. How is my 3D printer being supported by the manufacturer? One of the biggest names in the game, Prusa, has absolutely set the bar so incredibly high with their customer support, it's hard for other companies to catch up. Prusa has live chat, email, the Facebook groups are always active with members, and you have both unofficial and very official ways to get support if your 3D printer is acting up. I've had the pleasure of interacting with Prusa live chat on a handful of occasions, and their staff knows their stuff. The responses are timely, they're willing to work with you and talk with you and make sure that you're comfortable in the resolution. On the flip side of that, if you're looking at some other manufacturers, their email support is basically non-existent. Chances are you probably won't even get a response. Another side you might see is a company like Bamboo Lab. They're growing at just an absolutely exponential rate, and their customer support, from what I've heard, I haven't had to utilize it, can leave a bit to be desired, but they went from nobody to one of the biggest names in 3D printing in a span of less than 2 years. So I'm still willing to chalk that up partially to growing pains. Other companies, they're going to be more of a source your own support kind of machine, and chances are you're going to be spending some time on Reddit in r/fixmyprint or in a machine specific Facebook group where other members of the community are going to help guide you through the process. Personally, I've had a lot of luck on fixing my 3D printers by using these community sourced troubleshooting steps, and I recommend that you check those resources out if necessary. But customer service and customer support 2024 is one of those things where if you're looking for that hands-off approach, chances are it's going to be pretty important to you. If you're looking for a project and you want to tinker and you want to really just dive in there with your hands and your tools, then chances are you probably don't care about customer service at all. And that's one of those two halves of the same coin situation, but that's the beauty of 3D printing is regardless of what you're comfortable doing, what you want to do, and where you're going, there is a machine for you, there's a machine manufacturer for you, and there is a path in 3D printing for you. There you go. When I'm shopping for a 3D printer myself, those are the things that I look at. And if you found this video helpful and you used it to kind of guide your process on buying your first 3D printer, leave a comment below. Let us know what 3D printer you bought using the information that you gained here. And if you're still going through your decision process, that's fine. But just remember some golden advice. Buy once, cry once.